is involved in putting on this really important symposium. It's so central and so needed in this moment for all the reasons that you laid out in your introduction. And so I'm Nikki Jones. I'm a professor and H. Michael and Jeannie Williams Chair of the Department of African American Studies. I'm an ethnographer, and I've written 2 books that deal directly with Black communities, policing, and violence over the course of my career. The first book, Between Good and Ghetto, African American Girls and Inner City Violence. And the second one, The Chosen Ones, Black Men and the Politics of Redemption. And the first book was based in tough neighborhoods in Philadelphia. The second book was rooted in the Fillmore neighborhood of San Francisco. And it's through that work and work that I've done on policing as well that I'm often called on to give comment on public safety. And one of the things that I appreciate about your introduction is that it reflects the way that I think about public safety. So I don't come to this conversation through a kind of narrow lens of understanding the problem of violence or policing. I don't come to it thinking that there's a solution to be found through the paradigm of policing or law enforcement. I understand that we need a much broader lens. One of the ways that I think about this is through the framework of abolition democracy. And that's something that in my department, we've been spending a lot of time thinking about over the last couple of years, in part in direct response to the murder of George Floyd and the uprisings of summer 2020. And when you think about abolition democracy as a framework for thinking about public safety, you go back to the work of W.B. Du Bois, who argued that after the one divine event of emancipation and the victory of getting the Black vote, that there was still a gap, like there was still an absence. And what was really needed after emancipation was a commitment to developing the kinds of social institutions that could provide for a multiracial society, a society not based and rooted in racial domination and white supremacy, and that we haven't built up those institutions. It helps to explain all that you laid out at the top, Councilmember Fife, both in Oakland and in cities around the country. So what does it mean to think about public safety through this lens? And certainly others like Angela Davis have written about this as well, and thinking about abolition democracy as a way to disrupt the prison industrial complex, which we know that policing is a node in that. And so what would this look like? It would look like all the parts of the Black New Deal. So certainly housing. We are on the precipice of a crisis. I mean, we live in crisis in many ways, but as rent relief expires here and around the country and rents come due, we know exactly who that's going to impact the most. And to me, right, we should be thinking about that as a part of public safety, that we should be thinking about the well-being of those who are likely to be displaced and evicted as an element of public safety. Certainly schooling, right? There's been a lot happening in Oakland over the last several weeks around the violence of school closures and the impact of that on Brown and Black communities in the city. And certainly one of the things that Du Bois was thinking about and others is the need for a just and fair criminal justice system or criminal legal system. And so how do we get that in Oakland? One of the things that we've learned in the study of mass incarceration, and there's a National Academy of Sciences report that came out in 2014 that studied, right, this, so how did we get to the problem of mass incarceration? And this study wasn't like produced by a bunch of, radical folks or critical, especially critical thinking folks at the time. And what they found was that it is the particular politics of race in the United States and the reactionary crime politics that helped to drive mass incarceration. And so knowing that, it's quite striking to be in this moment where we are returning to those politics and those reactionary responses to the increases in spikes in violence, in gun violence, and also domestic violence, although we don't talk about that as much. There has been spikes in domestic violence as well, with this very reactionary politics. So 2 years after these uprisings against systemic racism and police violence, right, where you had folks seemingly in alignment, right, with centering themselves with those who are most likely to be targets of police violence. Now we see this kind of reactionary response to the spike, calling for more in law enforcement, calling for the heavy hand of law enforcement, even though we know that erodes the safety and well-being of communities. And that's something that we can certainly talk more about in the discussion. And so what we ought to be doing, what we need to be doing, and I hope that we've learned a little bit about over the last couple of years, is we need to be investing in the kinds of alternatives that build up the capacity of communities. We have organized around crime fighting. We've organized communities around crime fighting, which invites in a punitive response. But if we think about this frame of building up these social institutions, we need to be thinking about how do we build up the capacity of communities. And although, I recall the mayor saying maybe a year or so ago that there's no other research on the kinds of alternatives that will work outside of law enforcement. I tell you, coming from the academy, that's just not true, right? So we do know the kinds of things that build up the capacity of individuals and social networks and families and communities. And we can think about that at a couple of different levels. And I'll just provide a couple of examples and then open it up so we can get into the discussion. But certainly we know that there can be investments in the cityscape, right? There's research showing that the greening of lots, the abatement of vacant lots, investments in commercial corridors contribute to the capacity building of a community. What we need to be attuned to in those efforts is that they can't help to spur gentrification and displacement, right? And so you have to have a kind of laser-like focus on that in neighborhoods, or else the kind of economic exploitation and speculation that is already here will take over and will have a consequence of moving people out. The Anti-Police Terror Project's Mental Health First program, I think, is going to be a model for folks around the country. And when it comes to thinking about investing in alternative responses to crises like that involve mental health, which we know are a significant number when it comes to calls for police involvement or calls that end up with police involvement. Macro, I think, is another example of investing in the kinds of responses that address crises of public safety without exacerbating those crises, which is often the case when police become involved. I've done a lot of work on violence prevention and young people, and I know that there are ways to invest in both the practices and certain programs that reflect the kinds of practices that value Black life, that value Black youth, that want to see young people live, not just stop shooting, which is important, but want to see them live, right? And want to see them live free outside of prison. And so one of the most common approaches to violence prevention is to target those young people who are most likely to be involved either as a victim or perpetrator of violence, and to tell them stop, or the heavy hand of law enforcement is going to come down on your head. And one of the things that I advocate for is to target the same group of young people, but to flood them with resources and love, right? To give them a reason to stop shooting instead of trying to terrify them into stop shooting and then incarcerating them if they fail to do so, without understanding that change takes time. Changing one's behavior takes time, and it requires not just an individual to do something, it requires a community to walk alongside them. And so there are models of that. Advanced Peace is one model that came out of the Richmond model, but certainly investments in those kinds of alternatives, investments in what I describe as buffers and bridges for young people who are likely to be involved in violence. And so, putting ourselves in between young people and the harm that faces them, instead of pushing them further away because of the behavior that they're involved in. And bridges is just about, we know that there's a bridge set up between the neighborhood and the juvenile justice system, between the school and the juvenile and the criminal justice system, right? But we need those kinds of bridges to other social institutions and organizations that can help to build up the capacity of young people. And this is where the investments in the arts and youth serving organizations, in culture in the city is essential. Those are all elements of public safety, right? And because of that, it shouldn't be seen in a negative light at all, or somehow as anti-police to demand that resources be shifted to those organizations, because that is about the well-being of young people. And there's a body of research that shows that as well. And so certainly those kinds of investments, just a few examples there, are the kinds of investments that help to ensure public safety that's not driven by a moral panic, in a way that's not driven by a moral panic, that's not driven by white racial fear, right, which is deep, and certainly the call for more law enforcement. Folks will say and have told me, and I've talked to folks about, this is, not something that's foreign. Well, that Black people want the police, and I respect where that's coming from. And stepping back, I know that if white people didn't want them there too, they wouldn't be there in the way that they are, right? And so there's a way that white racial fear is exploited in a political sense to bring more policing to neighborhoods in ways that people want, right? Some people may want as a solution to the problem of crime and violence, but that history has shown is not, in fact, a solution to the problem of crime and violence. That more policing has a very marginal effect, a suppression effect, but it is not a long-term solution to solving the problems of violence, which gets us back to the abolition democracy framework, in which the Black New Deal, as I see it, is an extension of that and sits well in that. And so the last piece I'll say is, before opening up for conversation, is as I'm thinking about the comments and reviewing the material on the Black New Deal, it forces us to think about reparations, right? And what you are doing and laying out in many ways is a response to the question of, well, what do we do, right? You are laying it out, what we do. The Black New Deal lays it out. When the money comes, where do the investments go, right? Where does the government put the investment? Where do private institutions put the investment? And what kinds of protections have to be in place in order to ensure that those investments can have a positive impact, right, in the context of ongoing economic exploitation and state violence, right? And so I see this work certainly with the California Task Force on reparations, and just seeing the news yesterday that HR 40 is making some progress as well. I think that this kind of framework for addressing a host of issues, a host of problems, but including public safety, is exactly the kind of conversation and framework we need right now. I'll stop there.